The roar of rushing water tore through the peaceful afternoon as the sky split open, unleashing a torrent that would forever change Bethany Holloway's life. The 23-year-old miller's daughter had been working alone, grinding the last of the season's wheat when the creek beside her father's mill transformed from a gentle stream into a raging monster. It was the spring of 1873 in Willow Creek, a small but growing settlement in the Arizona Territory. The town had experienced its share of flash floods over the years, but none that had come on so suddenly or with such ferocity. Bethany had been minding the mill while her father traveled to Tucson for supplies, never imagining that the darkening clouds would bring such devastation. "This cannot be happening," Bethany whispered, watching in horror as muddy water began seeping under the wooden door of the mill. She had noticed the rain picking up outside, but had been so focused on finishing her work that she'd ignored the warning signs of the impending disaster. The old water mill sat at the base of a gentle slope, perfectly positioned to harness the creek's power for grinding grain. But that ideal location became a death trap as the swollen creek jumped its banks, sending a wall of water rushing downhill toward the building. Bethany ran to the door, pushing against it with all her might, but the pressure of the rising water outside had already sealed it shut. The windows were too small for her to squeeze through, and panic began to claw at her chest as the water continued to rise inside the mill. "Help!" she shouted, knowing full well that no one would hear her over the storm. The nearest ranch was a good mile away, and the town proper was even farther. She was completely alone. The water was already ankle-deep and rising fast. Bethany gathered her skirts and climbed onto the milling platform, desperately searching for another way out. The wooden structure groaned and creaked as the floodwaters battered against it, threatening to tear the entire building from its foundation. Miles away, Bryce Calloway was riding hard through the downpour, cursing his luck. The 30-year-old cowboy had spent the last 5 years working various ranches throughout the territory, finally saving enough to purchase his own modest spread just outside of Willow Creek. He'd been in town purchasing supplies when the storm hit, and now he was racing to get back to his property to secure his livestock before the worst of the deluge hit. The rain hammered against his hat and shoulders, soaking through his duster as he urged his horse forward. Thunder crashed overhead, causing his mount to sidestep nervously. "Easy, Thunder," Bryce soothed, patting the horse's wet neck. "We'll find shelter soon enough." As he rounded a bend in the trail, he caught sight of the creek that ran past the old mill. What had been a peaceful waterway that morning was now a churning, angry torrent, carrying branches and debris as it surged downstream. Bryce pulled his horse to a stop, his experienced eyes taking in the danger. "That's not good," he muttered, watching as the water continued to rise. His gaze drifted to the mill, and his stomach dropped when he realized the building was already partially submerged. Old Man Holloway's place would be washed away if the rain didn't let up soon. Then a movement caught his eye. Someone was inside, waving frantically from one of the small windows. Without a second thought, Bryce spurred his horse toward the mill. He'd met Holloway and his daughter a few times since moving to the area, exchanging pleasantries when their paths crossed in town. He knew the miller had gone to Tucson, which meant it had to be Bethany trapped inside. Inside the mill, Bethany's situation was growing dire. The water had risen to her knees as she stood on the platform, and the current was strong enough that she had to grip the milling equipment to keep her balance. The building shuddered as another surge of water slammed against it, and she heard the ominous crack of wood giving way somewhere below. "Please, Lord," she prayed, tears mingling with the spray of water on her face. "I don't want to die like this." A noise outside caught her attention, not the crash of thunder or rush of water, but the distinct sound of hoofbeats. Hope surged in her chest as she rushed to the window, pressing her face against the glass. Through the rain, she could make out a figure on horseback approaching the mill. "Help!" she screamed, banging on the window. "I'm trapped," Bryce dismounted at the edge of the flooded area surrounding the mill, tethering Thunder to a sturdy tree on higher ground. The water was already up to his thighs as he waded toward the building, fighting against the current. "Hello." He called out, "Is someone in there?" "Yes," came the muffled reply. "The door's stuck, I can't get out." Recognizing Bethany's voice, Bryce pushed harder against the rushing water. "It's Bryce Calloway. Hold on, Miss Holloway, I'm coming." Reaching the door, he found it thoroughly jammed, the pressure of the water making it impossible to open from either side. He threw his shoulder against it, but it barely budged. The water was rising faster now, already at his waist. "Stand back from the door," he shouted. Looking around, he spotted a large piece of driftwood floating nearby. He grabbed it, using it as a battering ram against the door. Inside, Bethany watched anxiously as the door shuddered with each impact. The water had now reached the platform, soaking the hem of her dress as she huddled against the wall. She could hear Bryce's efforts growing more frantic as he pounded against the door. "It's giving way," he called to her. "Just a little more." With a tremendous crack, the door splintered and Bryce kicked away the broken pieces. Water rushed into the already flooded mill, momentarily raising the level inside even higher. He pushed against the current, making his way in. "Bethany," he called, scanning the dim interior. "Over here." She responded, waving from her perch on the platform. The sight of her, pale and frightened but alive, filled Bryce with relief. He waded through the waist-deep water, extending his hand to her. "We need to get out of here fast," he said, his voice steady despite the urgency. "This whole place could come down any minute." Bethany nodded, taking his hand and stepping carefully into the water. The force of the current immediately pushed against her, and she would have fallen if Bryce hadn't caught her around the waist. "I've got you," he assured her, his grip firm. "Stay close to me." Together, they made their way toward the broken door, Bryce shielding Bethany from the brunt of the current with his body. Outside, the rain continued to fall in sheets, but the immediate danger was the rising floodwaters threatening to wash them both away. "My horse is tethered up on the ridge," Bryce explained, pointing to where Thunder waited nervously. "Think you can make it that far?" Bethany nodded determinedly, though her legs were already shaking from cold and fear. "I don't have much choice, do I?" Bryce's mouth quirked into a brief smile despite the gravity of their situation. "That's the spirit. Ready?" They pushed out of the relative shelter of the damaged mill into the full force of the flood. Bethany gasped as the cold water tugged at her skirts, threatening to pull her under. Bryce's arm around her waist tightened. "One step at a time," he encouraged. "Use me as an anchor." Slowly they made progress toward higher ground, every step a battle against the current. Bethany stumbled once, slipping beneath the surface momentarily before Bryce hauled her back up, coughing and sputtering. "Almost there," he assured her, though they were still a good distance from safety. A loud crack echoed above the roar of the water, and they both turned to see the mill's water wheel tear-free from its moorings, carried away by the flood. Seconds later, the entire front wall of the mill collapsed, sending a surge of debris-filled water in their direction. "Run!" Bryce shouted, practically lifting Bethany as they scrambled toward the ridge. The wave hit them from behind, knocking them both forward. Bryce maintained his grip on Bethany, pulling her up as they were pushed closer to the shore. With one final effort, he heaved them both onto the muddy incline, out of the worst of the flood waters. Exhausted, they lay on the wet ground for a moment, catching their breath. Bethany's clothes were plastered to her body, her long brown hair hanging in sodden ropes around her face. Bryce wasn't in much better shape, his hat long gone to the flood. "You saved my life," Bethany said once she could speak, looking at the cowboy with new eyes. She'd seen him around town, of course, but they'd never exchanged more than pleasantries. Now she felt a connection to him that went beyond simple gratitude. "Couldn't very well leave you there," Bryce replied, pushing himself to his feet and offering her a hand up. "Come on, we need to get you somewhere warm before you catch your death." Thunder nickered nervously as they approached, and Bryce soothed the animal with a gentle hand. "My place is closer than town," he told Bethany, untying the horse. "We can wait out the storm there if that's all right with you." Propriety dictated she should protest, but survival overrode social conventions. Besides, Bryce Calloway had a reputation as an honorable man. "That would be best, thank you," she agreed, allowing him to help her onto the horse before he swung up behind her. They rode in silence, Bryce's arms around Bethany as he held the reins. The rain had begun to ease, but the damage was done. All around them, the landscape had been transformed by the flood, familiar landmarks altered or washed away entirely. "The mill," Bethany said suddenly, her voice catching. "It's gone, isn't it?" Bryce's silence was answer enough. The mill had been her family's livelihood for 5 years, ever since they'd moved to the territory. The thought of telling her father about its destruction made her heart ache. "I'm sorry," Bryce finally said, "but buildings can be rebuilt. Lives can't. Your father will be thankful you're safe." They crested a small hill, and Bryce's ranch came into view, a modest cabin with a barn and corral. It wasn't much compared to some of the larger spreads in the area, but to Bryce, it represented years of hard work and saving. "It's not fancy," he said apologetically as they approached, "but it's dry." "It looks wonderful to me," Bethany replied honestly. Once they reached the cabin, Bryce helped her dismount before taking Thunder to the barn. "Go on inside," he called over his shoulder. "I need to check on the livestock. There's kindling by the stove, get a fire started if you can." Bethany pushed open the door to the small cabin, taking in her surroundings. It was a simple, one-room affair, a bed in one corner, a table and chairs in another, and a cast iron stove against the wall. Everything was neat and organized, if sparse. She found the kindling where Bryce had said it would be and set about starting a fire, grateful for the simple task that kept her mind off the disaster. By the time Bryce returned, the stove was warming the cabin, and Bethany had found a relatively dry towel to squeeze some of the water from her hair. "The cattle are fine," he reported, shrugging out of his wet duster. "Most of them had the sense to head to higher ground when the rain started." He ran a hand through his dripping hair, suddenly awkward now that the immediate danger was past. "I don't have any women's clothes, but I can lend you some of mine to change into while yours dry." Bethany blushed at the impropriety of the situation but nodded gratefully. "Thank you." "I'd appreciate that." Bryce rummaged through a trunk, pulling out a clean shirt and a pair of trousers that would be too large for her but were better than staying in her wet clothes. He handed them to her before grabbing another set for himself. "I'll step outside while you change," he offered, already heading for the door despite the continuing rain. Left alone, Bethany quickly stripped off her sodden dress and petticoats, hanging them near the stove to dry. Bryce's clothes swallowed her small frame, but they were warm and dry. She rolled up the sleeves and pant legs as best she could, then called out that it was safe for him to return. Bryce re-entered, having changed into dry clothes himself, his dark hair still damp. Something shifted in his expression when he saw her in his clothing, a softness appearing in his usually guarded eyes. "I'll make some coffee," he said, turning to the stove. "You must be frozen through." "I still can't believe you happened to be riding by," Bethany said, sitting at the table and watching him work. "Another few minutes and—" "Let's not think about that," Bryce interrupted gently. "You're safe now." They sat in companionable silence as the coffee brewed, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the diminishing patter of rain on the roof. When Bryce handed her a steaming mug, their fingers brushed, and Bethany felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the hot drink. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, wrapping her hands around the mug. Bryce shook his head. "No need, anyone would have done the same." "But it wasn't anyone, it was you." She met his gaze directly. "And I don't believe just anyone would have risked their life charging into a flooding mill." A flush crept up Bryce's neck, and he looked down at his coffee. "Well, I couldn't very well ride by knowing someone was in trouble." The evening stretched on as the storm gradually passed. They really talked for the first time since Bryce had moved to Willow Creek. Bethany learned that he'd spent years driving cattle before saving enough to buy his small ranch, while she told him about growing up in St. Louis before her mother's death had prompted her father to seek a fresh start in the Western Territories. It was hard at first, she admitted, leaving everything I knew behind, but there's something about this land that gets under your skin. Bryce nodded in understanding. That's why I stayed. Meant to keep moving, maybe head to California, but something about this place felt right. As night fell, the awkwardness of their situation returned. Bryce's cabin had only the one bed, and while he immediately offered to sleep on the floor, Bethany protested. You've already done so much. I couldn't put you out of your own bed. It's no trouble, he insisted. I've slept on worse than a cabin floor. In the end, Bryce made a pallet for himself near the stove while Bethany took the bed. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as she lay awake, listening to the soft sounds of Bryce's breathing across the room. Her life had been upended in a single afternoon the mill destroyed, her future uncertain yet strangely. She felt no despair. Perhaps it was the lingering shock, or perhaps it was the comforting presence of the man who had saved her. Morning brought clear skies and the daunting task of assessing the damage. Bethany's clothes had dried overnight, and she changed back into them behind a blanket Bryce had hung for privacy. Her dress was wrinkled and still bore the marks of the flood, but it was wearable. I should get back to town, she said after a simple breakfast of biscuits and coffee. My father will be returning from Tucson today or tomorrow. He needs to know what happened. Bryce nodded, already preparing to saddle Thunder. I'll take you. We can check on the mill site on the way, see if anything can be salvaged. The ride to the mill was sobering. The creek had returned to its banks, but the destruction left in its wake was staggering. Trees had been uprooted, fields flooded, and when they reached the mill site, Bethany's worst fears were confirmed. Only the stone foundation remained, the wooden structure completely washed away. Oh, she whispered, dismounting to stand among the ruins. Tears welled in her eyes as the full impact hit her. It's all gone. Bryce stood beside her, a silent support as she processed her loss. After a long moment, he gently touched her shoulder. We should keep going. Your father will be worried if he gets back and you're not there. The ride into Willow Creek was somber, both lost in their own thoughts. The town had fared better than the outlying areas, being built on slightly higher ground, though several buildings showed signs of water damage. They drew curious looks as they rode down the main street, Bethany perched in front of Bryce on his horse. By the time they reached the small house she shared with her father at the edge of town, Bethany knew the local gossips would be buzzing with speculation. Would you like me to wait with you for your father? Bryce offered as he helped her down from Thunder. Bethany shook her head. You've done enough already. Besides, you must have your own property to see to after the flood. He nodded, though he seemed reluctant to leave. If you need anything help rebuilding or just anything, you know where to find me. Thank you, Mr. Calloway, for everything. A faint smile touched his lips. I think after all this you might call me Bryce. Bryce, she repeated, the name feeling right on her lips. And I'm Bethany. He tipped his hat, his eyes lingering on her face for a moment longer than necessary before he turned Thunder and rode away. Benjamin Holloway returned from Tucson later that day, his wagon loaded with supplies for the mill that no longer existed. His shock and grief at the news of the flood was tempered by profound relief that his daughter had survived. Buildings can be replaced, he said, echoing Bryce's words from the day before. You cannot, my dear girl. In the days that followed, the community of Willow Creek rallied around the Holloways. Neighbors helped salvage what they could from the mill site, and the local banker offered extended terms on their loan. But the hard truth remained: rebuilding would be costly, and with the spring planting season already underway, they'd lost valuable time. A week after the flood, Bryce Calloway rode into town leading a wagon loaded with timber. He found Bethany and her father at the mill site, clearing debris. "Mr. Holloway," he called, dismounting. "Miss Holloway." Benjamin straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "Mr. Calloway, what brings you here?" "I heard you're planning to rebuild," Bryce said, gesturing to the wagon. "Thought you could use some lumber to get started." Benjamin's eyes widened at the sight of the high-quality pine boards. "That's mighty generous, but we can't accept such charity." "Not charity," Bryce corrected quickly. "An investment, if you will. This community needs its mill, and I need somewhere to grind my wheat when harvest comes." "Consider it an advance payment." Bethany watched the exchange with a warm feeling spreading through her chest. She'd thought of Bryce often in the past week, replaying their time together in her mind. "Well, when you put it that way," Benjamin said slowly, "I suppose we could work something out." Bryce smiled, his gaze drifting to Bethany. "I also brought an extra pair of hands if you'll have them. I'm handy with a hammer." And so began a new chapter. Bryce became a fixture at the mill site, arriving each morning to help with the rebuilding efforts. Other neighbors joined in when they could, but it was Bryce who worked alongside Benjamin day after day, his strong back and capable hands invaluable to the reconstruction. Bethany brought them lunch each day, lingering to help where she could. She found herself watching Bryce when he wasn't looking, the way his muscles moved under his shirt as he lifted a beam, the gentle way he handled the tools, the kindness he showed her father. For his part, Bryce found reasons to engage Bethany in conversation, asking her opinion on the placement of the water wheel or the arrangement of the grinding stones. Her practical nature and quick mind impressed him as much as her quiet beauty. One evening, as the summer sun hung low in the sky, Bethany brought a jug of cool water to Bryce, who was finishing up for the day. "You've been a godsend," she said frankly, watching him drink. "I don't know how we would have managed without your help." Bryce wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, a faint flush coloring his cheeks that had nothing to do with the day's heat. "I'm happy to help. Besides, I enjoy the company." Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. Bethany's heart quickened as Bryce took a step closer. "Bethany, there you are." Benjamin's voice broke the moment as he rounded the corner of the partially rebuilt mill. "Bryce, I've been thinking about that water diversion system you suggested. I believe it might work after all." The moment passed, but the feeling lingered. Over the following weeks, as summer ripened into early fall, the new mill took shape. Stronger than the old one, with improvements suggested by Bryce to help withstand future floods, it stood as a testament to the resilience of the Holloways and the community that supported them. Through it all, the connection between Bryce and Bethany deepened. They found moments alone walking back from town together, sharing quiet conversations while Benjamin worked inside the mill, sitting on the porch of the Holloway home as evening fell. They spoke of their pasts, their dreams, their fears, the initial bond formed in crisis evolving into something far more profound. The mill reopened in September, just in time for the first of the harvest to come in. The town celebrated with a gathering at the newly completed building with food, music, and dancing under the stars. Bethany wore her best dress, a blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes, and when Bryce asked her to dance, she went willingly into his arms. "You look beautiful tonight," he said softly, leading her through the steps of a waltz. "Only tonight?" she teased, enjoying the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. "Every day," he amended, "but especially tonight with the stars in your hair." They danced until their feet ached, then slipped away from the celebration to stand by the creek, calm now, and contained within its banks. The same water that had nearly claimed Bethany's life now flowed peacefully, powering the new mill wheel that turned slowly in the moonlight. "It's strange," Bethany mused, looking at the water. "Something so destructive can also be so necessary for life." Bryce stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Nature's like that, destructive and creative all at once. Like life," she added softly. "Sometimes terrible things happen, but they can lead to something wonderful." He turned to face her then, his expression serious in the silvery light. Bethany, I need to tell you something. I've been trying to find the right words for weeks now. Her heart hammered in her chest as she met his gaze. Yes, that day at the mill when I saw you in danger, I'd never been so scared in my life, not for myself but at the thought of not reaching you in time. He took her hand in his thumb tracing circles on her palm. I didn't understand it then, how a woman I barely knew could matter so much, but I do now. Bethany felt tears prickling behind her eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. I understand too. When I think about that day, I don't remember the fear anymore. I just remember you breaking down the door, pulling me to safety. Bryce's free hand came up to cup her cheek. I think I started falling in love with you that very day, though I didn't recognize it until later. Love, she whispered, hardly daring to believe she'd heard him correctly. Love, he confirmed, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. I love you, Bethany Holloway. I love your strength, your kindness, your determination. I love the way you care for your father, the way you never gave up even when everything seemed lost. I love, she cut him off with a finger to his lips, her own trembling with emotion. I love you too, Bryce Calloway. How could I not? You've shown me what true courage and compassion look like. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home. His lips were gentle yet insistent, his arms strong around her waist. Bethany wound her arms around his neck, giving herself fully to the moment she had dreamed of for months. They returned to the celebration hand in hand, their shared secret visible in their glowing faces. Benjamin noticed the change immediately, his knowing smile telling them he had seen this coming long before they had. The following spring, as wildflowers bloomed across the plains and the creek flowed full but gentle with the winter melt, Bethany Holloway became Bethany Calloway in a simple ceremony at the town church. The entire community turned out to celebrate the union that had been born from disaster and nurtured through rebuilding. They made their home at Bryce's ranch, though Bethany still helped her father at the mill several days a week. The Calloway property flourished under their joint care, expanding to include more cattle and fields of golden wheat that would eventually be ground at Holloway's mill. On their first anniversary, Bryce took Bethany for a ride to a special spot he'd found, a natural overlook that provided a view of the entire valley, including both the mill and their ranch in the distance. "Happy anniversary, my love," he said, spreading a blanket for them to sit on. Bethany smiled, settling beside him and leaning against his solid warmth. "It's been the most wonderful year of my life, mine too." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Though I hope there are many more, each better than the last." "There will be," she assured him, taking his hand and placing it gently on her stomach. "Especially now." It took a moment for understanding to dawn on Bryce's face. When it did, his expression transformed with wonder. "You mean, yes," she confirmed, laughing at his stunned joy. "Come winter, there will be 3 of us." Bryce gathered her into his arms, his happiness too great for words. As they held each other under the vast Arizona sky, Bethany reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun in terror, trapped in a flooding mill, certain she would die, had led to the greatest love and deepest joy she had ever known. The creek that had nearly taken her life had also, in its way, given her a new one. For if the flood hadn't come, Bryce might never have broken down that door and pulled her from the rising waters. He might never have taken her to his home, shared his clothes and his coffee, and eventually, his heart. Sometimes, Bethany thought as Bryce's hand caressed her still flat stomach, life's greatest blessings came from its darkest moments. The mill had been rebuilt, stronger than before. And so had she, finding strength she never knew she possessed, and love she'd never dared to dream of, all because a brave cowboy had refused to ride past a flooding mill without making sure everyone inside was safe.